The Panzer commander stood beside his frozen tank, watching 3 Soviet T-34s glide through the snowdrift like sharks through water. His crew huddled inside their metal coffin, unable to start the engine, unable to move, unable to fight. Just 6 months ago, they had laughed at intelligence reports about these Russian machines. Now, as the temperature dropped to -40 and those same tanks circled closer, Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler realized their arrogance had brought them to this frozen grave. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer of 1941 had been glorious for the Wehrmacht. Operation Barbarossa rolled across the Soviet frontier with the mechanical precision that had conquered Poland and France. Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler commanded a Panzer IV, leading a column of German armor through the dusty roads of western Russia. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, golden wheat fields burning in their wake, villages abandoned, the Red Army in full retreat. Victory seemed inevitable, almost boring in its certainty. Kessler was 32 years old, a veteran of the campaigns in the West, decorated with the Iron Cross for his actions during the breakthrough at Sedan. His crew had been together since the beginning, 5 men who moved as a single organism inside the cramped interior of their tank. Gunner Werner Schultz could put a round through a moving target at 1,500 meters. Loader Hans Dietrich could reload in under 5 seconds, even under fire. Driver Kurt Brenner knew every gear, every mechanical quirk of their Panzer. Radio operator Josef Klein kept them connected to battalion command, his steady voice a lifeline during the chaos of battle. They rolled through the summer heat with their hatches open, drinking in the wind, singing songs about their victories. The Russian tanks they encountered were pathetic. The T-26 light tanks crumpled like tin cans under German guns. The BT series fast tanks ran away faster than they fought. Even the heavier KV-1s, though difficult to penetrate, were so poorly coordinated that German crews could outmaneuver them, targeting their tracks or catching them from behind. Then came the first encounter with the T-34. It happened on a dusty afternoon in late July, outside a small town whose name Kessler never learned. His company was advancing in column formation when the lead tank exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The second tank barely had time to traverse its turret before another shell punched through its side armor, killing the crew instantly. Kessler screamed orders into his radio, his heart pounding as he scanned the tree line for the enemy. The Soviet tank emerged from behind a barn like an apparition. Kessler had never seen anything like it. The hull sat low to the ground, its armor sloped at radical angles that made it look almost streamlined, almost modern. The long barrel of its 76mm gun tracked toward his position with deliberate precision. He shouted for Schultz to fire, but their shell bounced off the sloped armor with a shower of sparks, ricocheting into the sky. The T-34 fired back. The round passed so close to Kessler's head that he felt the heat, felt the air pressure change, felt his ears ring with the sonic crack. It missed his tank by centimeters, slamming into the building behind them. He dove into the turret, slamming the hatch shut, as Brenner threw the Panzer into reverse. They retreated in disorder, leaving 2 burning hulks behind them. That evening, the company gathered for debriefing. The officers tried to maintain confidence, but Kessler saw the uncertainty in their eyes. Intelligence officers had mentioned the T-34 in their reports, but no one had taken it seriously. Russian tanks were supposed to be inferior, crude machines built by a backward nation. This tank was neither crude nor inferior. Its armor was better, its gun more powerful, its design more advanced than anything Germany had fielded. But the officers reassured them. Yes, the T-34 was a good tank, perhaps even an excellent tank. But German crews were better trained, better coordinated, better led. German tactics were superior. German optics gave them better visibility. German radios allowed better communication. The Wehrmacht would adapt, would overcome, would prevail as it always had. Most importantly, winter was still months away, and the campaign would be over long before the first snow fell. Kessler wanted to believe them. The advance continued, and the T-34s they encountered were often handled poorly by their crews. Soviet armor attacked piecemeal, without infantry support, without reconnaissance, without coordination. German gunners learned to aim for the turret ring or the lower hull where the armor was thinner. They learned to use terrain and concealment, to ambush rather than fight head-on. The kill ratio remained favorable, and Moscow drew closer with each passing day. August turned to September, September to October. The weather began to change. Morning frost appeared on the grass, and the nights grew longer and colder. The dusty roads turned to mud as autumn rains swept across the steppe. The panzer columns slowed, struggling through seas of thick, clinging muck that sucked at their tracks and exhausted their crews. Supply convoys fell behind schedule. Fuel became scarce. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Still, the high command insisted that victory was within reach, that one more push would break Soviet resistance. Kessler noticed other changes. The Soviet defenders fought with increasing desperation, with increasing skill. The T-34s appeared more frequently, sometimes in coordinated groups that supported each other, that used terrain effectively, that retreated before they could be surrounded. His crew began to speak less confidently about easy victory. Klein, usually talkative on the radio, became quiet and withdrawn. Dietrich developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking his ammunition. Schultz cleaned his gun sight obsessively, as if perfect optics could guarantee survival. November brought the first real snow. It fell in thick curtains, blanketing the landscape in white, transforming the muddy roads into frozen ruts. The temperature dropped steadily, 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 below zero. Kessler ordered his crew to start the engine every 2 hours to prevent the oil from freezing solid. They burned precious fuel just to keep the Panzer operational. The other tanks in his company did the same, their engines coughing and sputtering in the bitter cold. The infantry suffered worse. Men who had sweated through the summer heat now shivered in inadequate uniforms, their summer tunics offering little protection against the Russian winter. Frostbite casualties mounted. Sentries froze to death at their posts. The wounded died, not from their injuries, but from exposure during evacuation. The high command had promised this would be over before winter. They had lied or been wrong, and now tens of thousands of German soldiers paid the price for that miscalculation. Kessler's company established a defensive position outside a village that served as a supply depot. They dug their tanks into revetments, covering them with camouflage nets dusted with snow. The position offered good fields of fire across open ground, with the village at their backs providing some shelter from the wind. For 3 days, they waited in the cold, watching the horizon, seeing nothing but endless white. The attack came at dawn on the 4th day. Kessler was huddled in his sleeping bag beneath the tank when he heard Klein's urgent voice on the radio. Soviet armor approaching from the northeast, multiple contacts, moving fast. He scrambled into the turret, his fingers clumsy in the cold, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Through his periscope, he saw them. 3 T-34s advancing in line abreast, their wide tracks barely sinking into the snow. They moved with a speed that seemed impossible in these conditions, gliding across terrain that would bog down a German Panzer. Behind them came infantry in white camouflage suits, barely visible against the snow. Kessler grabbed his radio microphone and ordered his company to engage. The first volley missed. The T-34s were moving too fast, weaving unpredictably, their low profiles difficult to track against the white background. Schultz cursed and adjusted his aim, leading the target, compensating for wind and distance. His second shot struck home, as hitting the lead T-34 on its frontal armor. The shell bounced off with a bright spark, deflected by the sloped plate. The Soviet tank didn't even slow down. Kessler watched in disbelief as the T-34 returned fire on the move, something his crew had been taught was nearly impossible with any accuracy. The round slammed into the Panzer beside them, penetrating the thinner side armor, brewing up the tank in an instant. 4 men died before they could escape. The surviving crew member staggered from the flames, his uniform burning, screaming until a Soviet machine gun cut him down. Brenner tried to maneuver their tank, to bring them hull down, behind the revetment, but the engine coughed and died. He cranked the starter again and again, but the motor refused to turn over. The oil had thickened in the cold. The fuel lines had frozen. The battery had lost its charge. Their tank, their fortress, their protection, had become their tomb. The other panzers fared no better. Of the 8 tanks in the defensive position, 5 failed to start. The crews worked frantically, heating the engines with blowtorches, pouring precious fuel into starting fires beneath the hulls, anything to coax life into the frozen machines. the T-34s closed the distance, their diesel engines running smoothly, their wide tracks distributing weight so efficiently that they seemed to float across the snow. Kessler made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered his crew to abandon the tank. They grabbed their personal weapons, their ammunition, whatever they could carry, and dropped through the belly hatch into the snow. Around them, other crews did the same, retreating toward the village as Soviet shells turned their Panzers into burning wrecks. The T-34s pursued relentlessly, firing on the move, coordinating with their infantry, exploiting every advantage the winter gave them. The village offered little sanctuary. It was a collection of wooden houses and barns, already half destroyed by earlier fighting. Kessler gathered the survivors, perhaps 50 men from his company, and organized a defense. They had rifles, a few machine guns, some Panzerfaust rockets, nothing that could stop a determined assault. Through the windows, they watched the T-34s circle like predators, methodical and patient, waiting for the moment to strike. Night fell quickly in the Russian winter. By 4 in the afternoon, darkness covered the landscape, broken only by the stars and the orange glow of burning tanks. The temperature dropped further, 20 below, 25 below. Cold so intense that exposed skin froze in seconds. Kessler's men huddled together in one of the larger buildings, sharing body heat, rationing their ammunition and food. The radio had been left in the abandoned tank, so they had no contact with battalion headquarters, no hope of reinforcement or rescue. Brenner spoke first, his voice bitter and angry. He said what they were all thinking. The high command had sent them here to die. They had been lied to about the enemy's capabilities, about the timeline, about the weather. The T-34 wasn't just good, it was better than anything Germany had. Better armor, better armament, better mobility, and most critically, built for this environment while German tanks were designed for the roads of France and Poland. Schultz disagreed. He insisted that German engineering was still superior, that the T-34 only succeeded because of Russian tactics and terrain. Given proper support, proper maintenance, proper supply lines, the Wehrmacht would still prevail. The two men argued back and forth, their voices rising, until Kessler ordered them both to shut up. The question of who had the better tank was academic when you were freezing to death in a burned-out village. Klein suggested surrender. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, but he said it. The Soviets were winning this battle. Winter was their ally, and the Wehrmacht had no answer for it. They could surrender now with dignity, become prisoners of war, survive to see their families again. Better that than dying here for nothing, freezing or burning or bleeding out in the snow for a cause that was already lost. Dietrich slapped him. The sound echoed in the cold room, shocking everyone into silence. Dietrich called Klein a coward, a traitor, said that German soldiers didn't surrender, that they fought to the last man, to the last bullet. Klein touched his bleeding lip, but said nothing more. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Men who had been brothers in arms now divided by fear and desperation, and the terrible realization that everything they had believed was crumbling around them. Kessler stood and walked to the window. Outside, he could see the dark shapes of the T-34s still circling, their engines purring softly, conserving fuel, waiting. He thought about his wife back in Hamburg, about his 2 children, who barely remembered what their father looked like. He thought about the letters he had sent home, full of confidence and victory, describing how the Russian campaign would be over by autumn. Those letters were lies now, though he hadn't known it when he wrote them. He turned back to his men and told them they would hold until dawn. If relief didn't come by morning, they would attempt a breakout to the west, moving on foot through the forest, trying to reach German lines. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than surrender and better than waiting here to freeze. The men nodded, grateful for any decision, any sense of purpose beyond simply enduring. The Soviet assault began at midnight. It started with artillery, shells whistling overhead and exploding among the buildings, setting wooden structures ablaze, filling the air with smoke and splinters. Then came the infantry, white-clad figures materializing from the darkness, firing as they advanced. The Germans returned fire from windows and doorways, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions, making them targets. One of the T-34s rolled forward, crushing the fence around the village, its machine gun raking the buildings. Kessler saw one of his men, a young corporal whose name he couldn't remember, "Rise with a Panzerfaust." The boy aimed carefully, steadied himself, and fired. The rocket streaked across the short distance and struck the T-34's track, severing it in a shower of sparks. The tank lurched to a halt, immobilized but not destroyed. The turret traversed toward the buildings where the corporal stood. The 76mm gun fired point blank. The corporal, the window, and half the wall simply ceased to exist. The battle lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of chaos and terror, of men dying in the dark, of ammunition running low, of the cold so intense that weapons jammed and fingers couldn't pull triggers. Kessler found himself fighting with a rifle he had taken from a dead soldier, firing at shadows, not knowing if he hit anything. Around him, his company dissolved. Some men fell to Soviet bullets, some fled into the night and vanished. Some simply stopped fighting, dropped their weapons, and waited for the end. When the final Soviet assault came, Kessler and 9 others were still fighting. They had barricaded themselves in the village church, a stone building that offered some protection from small arms fire. The T-34s surrounded them, their guns pointed at the walls, waiting for the order to fire. A Soviet officer approached under a white flag, shouting in broken German. He offered terms. Surrender now and be treated as prisoners of war. Refuse and be buried in the rubble. Kessler looked at the men around him. Brenner had taken shrapnel to his leg and could barely stand. Schultz had lost 2 fingers to frostbite. Dietrich stared at nothing, his eyes empty, his mind broken. Klein was already dead, killed in the first minutes of the assault. These were the survivors of a company that had numbered 120 men just 3 months ago. The proud tank crews who had rolled across Russia singing songs of victory. He walked out of the church with his hands raised. The others followed, limping and stumbling, more dead than alive. Soviet soldiers surrounded them, taking their weapons, searching them roughly for valuables. The officer who had called for surrender looked at Kessler with something like pity. He spoke again in his broken German, asking if Kessler understood now, if he finally understood what they were facing. Kessler said nothing. What was there to say? That the intelligence reports had been wrong? That the high command had lied? That German engineering and German training and German superiority had meant nothing against an enemy who understood this land, who had prepared for this winter, who had built machines designed for this exact war? The Soviet officer gestured to the burning village, to the destroyed German tanks, to the frozen bodies scattered in the snow. He said that this was just the beginning. He said that summer had been the Wehrmacht's time, but winter belonged to Russia. He said that every German soldier who remained on Soviet soil would end up just like Kessler's company, frozen or burned or buried beneath the snow they had been too arrogant to prepare for. They marched the prisoners east, away from the front lines, through landscapes of endless white. Kessler walked in a daze, his mind struggling to process everything that had happened. Behind them, one of the T-34s fired up its engine and began following, escorting the column, its wide tracks leaving parallel marks in the snow. The sound of that diesel engine would haunt him for years afterward, a mechanical growl that represented everything the Wehrmacht had underestimated about the Red Army. During the march, Kessler learned things that made his defeat even more bitter. The T-34's sloped armor wasn't just effective, it was revolutionary, distributing impact force and increasing effective thickness without adding weight. The wide tracks that had seemed crude actually provided superior ground pressure, allowing the tank to operate in conditions that would bog down narrow-tracked German Panzers. The diesel engine, which German engineers had rejected as inferior to gasoline, proved far more reliable in extreme cold, with fuel that didn't freeze and an ignition system that worked when German magnetos failed. But the real advantage wasn't technological, it was strategic. The Soviets had designed the T-34 specifically for the war they expected to fight, on their terrain, in their climate, against the specific enemy they knew was coming. German tanks were built for the war Germany wanted to fight, the war of rapid movement across good roads in temperate weather. When those conditions disappeared, when mud and snow and cold replaced them, the technical sophistication of German armor became a liability rather than an advantage. Brenner died during the march, his wounded leg becoming infected, the cold finishing what Soviet shrapnel had started. They left his body beside the road, covered with a thin layer of snow. Schultz lost his remaining fingers to frostbite and would never operate a tank gun again. Dietrich eventually spoke again, but the light never returned to his eyes. He had seen too much, endured too much, lost too much of himself in that frozen village. The prisoner of war camp was located deep in Siberia, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire and guard towers. Thousands of German soldiers were already there, men from infantry units and artillery batteries and tank companies just like Kessler's. They all told similar stories: the initial victories, the confidence bordering on arrogance, the shocking moment when they realized the enemy was stronger than expected, the terrible revelation that winter would be their executioner. Kessler spent 3 years in that camp, 3 years of labor and hunger and disease, of watching men die from cold and malnutrition and despair. He survived through a combination of luck and stubbornness, through trading his watch for extra food, through volunteering for work details that offered warmer quarters, through simply refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. During those years, he heard news of the war filtered through Soviet propaganda and whispered rumors. The Wehrmacht had failed to take Moscow. The siege of Leningrad dragged on year after year. At Stalingrad, an entire German army had been surrounded and destroyed, 300,000 men dead or captured because they couldn't adapt to Russian winter, because their supply lines couldn't cope with the distances, because their tanks froze while Soviet armor kept fighting. He thought often about that summer day when he had first encountered the T-34, about the arrogance that had led him to dismiss it as just another Russian machine, inferior by definition, because it was built by an enemy Germany considered backward. He thought about the intelligence briefings that had assured them winter would never come, that the campaign would be over in weeks, that Soviet resistance was about to collapse. He thought about all the lies, official and unofficial, that had brought a generation of German soldiers to their deaths in the snow. When the war finally ended in 1945, Kessler was one of the prisoners released to return home. He made the long journey west, traveling by train and truck and foot, through landscapes devastated by years of fighting. The Germany he returned to barely existed. Cities were rubble, factories were ruins. His hometown of Hamburg was a burned-out shell. His wife had died in an air raid. His children were being raised by relatives in the countryside, growing up without parents in a defeated nation. He never spoke much about his experiences. What was there to say? That he had been part of an army that invaded a peaceful neighbor, that he had burned villages and killed soldiers who were defending their homeland? That his suffering in the prisoner of war camp, real as it was, paled beside the suffering his army had inflicted on millions of Soviet citizens? The guilt was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that his own arrogance had contributed to the disaster. But sometimes, late at night, unable to sleep, he would remember that moment outside the frozen village. He would remember standing beside his dead tank, watching 3 T-34s circle through the snow with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. He would remember the sound of their diesel engines, smooth and confident, while his own Panzer sat silent and frozen. He would remember the Soviet officers' words about German arrogance, about thinking they understood war when they had only fought the wars they wanted to fight. The T-34 had been more than a good tank. It had been the perfect tank for the war it was designed to fight. Not the most sophisticated, not the most powerful, not the best in abstract engineering terms, but the most effective, the most practical, the most suited to its purpose. It had wide tracks for Russian mud and snow. It had sloped armor to defeat German guns. It had a diesel engine that worked in Russian winter. It had been simple enough to mass produce, reliable enough to maintain with limited logistics, and good enough to win the war. Years later, Kessler saw a T-34 in a museum. It sat behind velvet ropes, its paint faded, its tracks worn, a relic of the war that had consumed his youth. He stood before it for a long time, studying the sloped armor that had turned aside so many German shells, the wide tracks that had carried it through conditions that immobilized Panzers, the diesel engine that had kept running when gasoline motors froze solid. A young curator approached and asked if he had served in the war. Kessler nodded. The curator, eager to share his knowledge, began explaining the T-34's technical specifications, its impact on tank design, its role in Soviet victory. Kessler listened politely, but he didn't need the lecture. He had learned everything he needed to know about the T-34 on a frozen morning outside a nameless village, when his world of certainties had collapsed into the snow. The curator asked if Kessler had any memories he wanted to share, any stories from the war. The old man was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the tank, his mind decades in the past. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. He said that his crew had laughed at the T-34 when they first heard about it. They had thought it was just another crude Russian machine, built by an inferior nation, destined to be crushed beneath the treads of superior German armor. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. He said they had laughed right up until winter came, until their tanks froze and the T-34s kept moving, until they found themselves outmaneuvered and outfought by the machine they had mocked. He said that war had a way of teaching lessons to the arrogant, and the price of those lessons was measured in frozen bodies and burning tanks. The curator asked if he thought the T-34 was the reason Germany lost the war. Kessler shook his head. The T-34 was just a tank, a piece of metal and machinery. Germany lost the war because of arrogance, because of poor planning, because they underestimated their enemy and overestimated themselves. The T-34 was simply the instrument through which those mistakes were punished. Any nation foolish enough to invade Russia without preparing for Russian winter deserved to fail. The tank was just the messenger. He left the museum shortly after, walking slowly, an old man carrying old memories. Behind him, the T-34 sat silent and still, its wide tracks forever frozen, its sloped armor no longer needed. But in the winter of 1941, on snowy fields outside forgotten villages, it had been death itself, gliding through the snow while German Panzers sat frozen and helpless. It had been the sound of diesel engines when gasoline motors failed. It had been the proof that sophistication meant nothing without adaptation, that confidence was worthless without preparation, that wars were won not by the army that seemed strongest, but by the army that understood the battlefield. The story of the T-34 and the German tank crews who learned to fear it was a story about more than just armor and guns and mechanical engineering. It was a story about hubris and its consequences, about the dangers of underestimating an enemy, about the critical importance of designing weapons for the wars you will actually fight rather than the wars you want to fight. The Germans had built beautiful tanks, sophisticated tanks, tanks that worked wonderfully on the roads of France. But in the mud and snow of Russia, all that sophistication became a liability. Hauptmann Friedrich Kessler died in 1978, an old man in a rebuilt country, his past locked behind the Iron Curtain he had helped create through his participation in the invasion. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, noting only that he had been a tank commander on the Eastern Front. It didn't mention the T-34s that had haunted his nightmares. It didn't mention the frozen morning when his certainties had shattered. It didn't mention the lesson he had learned too late, that warfare is not about having the best technology, but about having the right technology for the right conditions. The T-34 continued its service long after the war, appearing in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East, proving its worth again and again. Soviet factories had built more than 80,000 of them during the war years, an industrial achievement that matched the tank's battlefield performance. Even decades after their heyday, they remained effective, their simple design allowing armies with limited maintenance capabilities to keep them running, their rugged construction allowing them to absorb punishment and continue fighting. But the true legacy of the T-34 wasn't in its specifications or its production numbers. It was in what it represented, the triumph of practical design over theoretical perfection, the victory of preparation over improvisation. The Germans had invaded with tanks built for a quick campaign in good weather. The Soviets had defended with tanks built for a long war in terrible conditions. When winter came and revealed which approach was correct, the outcome became inevitable. For Kessler and the tens of thousands like him, men who had mocked the T-34 only to be destroyed by it, the lesson came too late. They had learned that sloped armor mattered more than they thought, that wide tracks were crucial rather than crude, that diesel engines would outlast gasoline in the cold. They had learned these lessons in burning villages and frozen fields, paying for their education with their lives and their freedom and their futures. The T-34 had been their teacher, and Russian winter had been their classroom, and the tuition had been impossibly high. Standing beside that museum display decades later, Kessler had understood something his younger self could never have grasped. The T-34 wasn't a better tank because of any single feature. It was better because every feature worked together toward a single purpose, fighting and winning on the Eastern Front in all conditions. The sloped armor, The wide tracks, the diesel engine, the simple construction, all of it combined into a weapon perfectly suited to its environment. German tanks were technological marvels that failed when conditions changed. The T-34 was a practical tool that worked no matter what. That was the story of German tank crews who laughed at the T-34, the story of confidence turning to horror as winter revealed the truth. They had mocked what they didn't understand, dismissed what they hadn't studied, underestimated what they should have feared. The snow and ice had been their executioner, but the T-34 had been the instrument of their doom, gliding through blizzards while Panzers sat frozen, proving that, in war as in life, adaptation mattered more than sophistication. Preparation trumped improvisation, and respect for your enemy was the first requirement of survival. The Germans had learned this lesson the hardest way possible, and the T-34 had been their teacher, patient and implacable and utterly without mercy.